Well, hello and welcome to this Connecting Europe webinar about the EU's answer to Russia invasion in Ukraine. I'm Sophie Pornschlegel. I'm a senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center and project lead of Connecting Europe, which is we'll say 2 cents about that. It's a joint initiative of the European Policy Center in Brussels with Stiftung Mercator, a German foundation, to help civil society organizations connect with the EU policy community and also transnationalize debate. And we thought it would be really smart to have a webinar at this point in time to discuss the EU answer to the Russian invasion, as a lot happened. There were a lot of sanction packages, and it's time to discuss this. Shortly on the topic, it's been almost a month since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we saw a united European response. I think everyone was slightly surprised by how quickly the EU reacted. We're currently at the 4th package of sanctions, and there's a 5th in discussion. And next to the sanctions, we already had a temporary directive to make sure that Ukrainian refugees can stay in Europe, and also some military and humanitarian support. So trying to make sense of all these sanctions, I have with me 2 wonderful speakers today. The first one is Amanda Paul, who is Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center in the Europe in the World program. And I also have Jakob Kirkegaard with me, who is Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and also Brussels-based. Quickly on the structure, we have an hour to discuss. We'll start with short opening statements and a quick discussion, but I would like to open up the floor relatively quickly. I think, or I hope that everyone knows how Zoom works these days, so don't hesitate to raise your hand so you can come in, or just write your question down and I will read it. So that is it for my introduction, and I'd like to give the word to Amanda straight away. So maybe if you can give us your assessment of the EU's response so far. Has the EU gone far enough? What has happened anyway? Maybe you can give us a broad overview, Amanda.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. I'll try and be quick, 5 or 6 minutes, I promise. First of all, I think that the EU's response to this senseless war has been quick, it's been robust, and it's been pretty well coordinated with the US and other allies. As you rightly said, there has been unprecedented unity. I think this reflects the gravity of the situation on the ground. I think it's crucial that we don't show Russia any weakness or uncertainty. And as you mentioned, crucial meetings are going to be taking place later this week with President Biden, both in the context of NATO, but also in the EU. I mean, first of all, let's be clear. Russia wants to destroy Ukraine, to break Ukraine's resolve and resistance. Now, Russia has failed to make any meaningful progress on the ground. So Russia today is doing what it did back in Syria and in Grozny. It's flattening towns, it's killing civilians, attacking humanitarian corridors, carrying out actually blatant war crimes and huge acts of cruelty. For example, bombing hospitals, schools and residential areas. And the bloody siege of Mariupol, this is actually a humanitarian catastrophe, which is going to be remembered for centuries to come. And unfortunately, the seaport of Odessa is likely to be Putin's next target unless we, the West, are able to stop him. We can already see that Russian warships are shelling residential areas in Odessa. Now, the EU so far, it's used what I would call its full toolkit. So from broad economic, sectorial and targeted sanctions, so far there's been 4 rounds. It's important to continue to close the loopholes in these sanctions and to track sanctions avoidance, because this happens all the time, and also to further increase the sanctions. All international companies really need to be pressurized to stop trading with Russia. The EU really must use its full economic weight against the Kremlin. Also, as you mentioned, the activation of the European Peace Facility, which enabled to equip Ukraine with arms, was also a major development. I would say that it shows the EU is emerging as a geopolitical security actor. And as you also said, the EU has welcomed millions of refugees. It triggered the Temporary Protection Directive. This was drafted back in 2001, but it's never been used. This is really important because it gives these refugees huge protection. It allows them to have, well, the same rights as me as a non-Belgian, for example, to be able to reside and work, etc., to get medical assistance and education. I would say there's been some sort of geopolitical awakening by the EU, not least in Germany. We've seen that the EU's become more empowered already to take more responsibility for its own security. There's also really strong public opinion throughout EU 27 for the EU to be more responsible for its defense. I think the question here is whether this geopolitical awakening is sustainable and whether the EU is really able to play power politics in the long run. This remains to be seen. Now, when we look at this, coming back to the sanctions, I think that the EU's dependency on Russian oil and gas is going to be hugely problematic. I mean, it already is, but it's going to continue to be problematic because this money is crucial in Russia's war machine. I mean, back in 2008, I remember EU member states committed to reducing their dependence on Russian oil and gas, and this hasn't happened. Now, later this week, we're going to be seeing EU leaders meet to talk about a fifth round of sanctions. And to my mind, to really put the squeeze onto Russia, it's really important that energy sector sanctions are really put in place here, whether it's like coal, oil, or gas. They need to be agreed. But I think we're starting to see some cracks in member states as there is divisions on this topic, and this may make it or will make it more difficult to get an agreement. But it is really important they do get an agreement, and it would be great if we could see a proper ban on the import of oil, for example. I think in some EU capitals there's a tendency now to think, okay, let's wait and see. We want to assess the impact of the sanctions that have already been put in place. But frankly speaking, I mean, Ukraine doesn't have time for this. Europe, the world doesn't have time. So something concrete really needs to come out of this summit, perhaps, on coal, for example. And at the same time, I think that politicians across Europe, they need to better mobilize public support to move away from fossil fuel. They need to find more ways to take the pain out of receiving higher energy bills, which are definitely going to be coming if they haven't already come. I just want to make another couple of recommendations for the EU, if I may. I think it's clear at this point that there's going to be no closing of Ukraine's airspace by NATO. Because of this, I mean, it's really important that NATO, the West, continues to give Ukraine what it really needs to help protect itself, to defend itself to the best of its ability. And it urgently still requires, weapons of both defensive and offensive, including, man-portable air defense and anti-tank weapons, air defense missiles, fighter planes, air defense system, artillery, ammunition, and really basic things. And they should get these basic things for free, actually: helmets, bulletproof vests, night goggles, fuel, medicine, etc. These things are really crucial for Ukraine in its resistance. When it comes to the Ukrainian economy, I mean, let's be frank, I think it's heading near the brink of collapse, which is why it's really important that despite these difficult times, that financial support to Ukrainian companies is actually given, and we find creative ways to allow them to continue to function at this difficult time. I mean, I also support Ukraine's international debt being totally cancelled. When it comes to, I'm nearly finishing now, I think we also need to invest in the necessary financial resources, as well as specialized human resources to catalog the war crimes, because there's so many war crimes going on every single day in Ukraine. These need to be put down and documented properly if we want to see President Putin and other cronies involved in this horrific war in court. So it's really important to get first-hand information from those that are fleeing the country as well as on the ground. And this will require financial assistance, international financial assistance to be able to do this, including from EU member states. And my very last point, because I know I probably exceeded 5 minutes, is Ukraine should not be feeling pressurized into accepting a deal, a peace deal, because Europe wants an end to this war. And I have the sensation there's already some, thinking about this. This would be a major mistake. Ukrainians know, and we should know this as well from our history, that only victory is going to bring a long-lasting peace. So it's really important that they don't feel this pressure, that we continue to support them in every way we can. So those are my brief opening comments.
Thanks a lot, Amanda, for the very comprehensive introduction. I think you mentioned a few points that we'll definitely come back to. The term power politics, and is the EU really having this shift of paradigm? Are the sanctions sustainable? The wait and see position that we see of member states at the moment to kind of see how the sanctions, have an effect. And also the question of, a resolution of this war and whether it will need a dirty deal or whether we can come to peace. I'll go straight to Jakob, who is with us. And maybe my question to you is, what do you think are these sanctions going to be effective in stopping Putin? I mean, that's been like the huge question about these sanctions. Are we going to pressurize and make, Russia a pariah state? Is this going to help Ukraine? What is your assessment of the current answer of the EU? I think you're muted. Jakob, I think you're still muted. I can't hear you.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm still learning, clearly. No, well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And let me start by saying that I really think that the key to these sanctions, as Amanda already mentioned, that yes, there's been remarkable unity within the EU. A lot of stuff has been agreed very quickly, but it's not just the EU. A lot of these sanctions, financial, etc., are actually the entire G7 plus additional financial centers in Asia, etc. The same is very importantly true for many of the technology sanctions. That's going to have, in my opinion, a significant medium and long-term impact. And then, of course, a lot of the weapons deliveries, etc., has been, largely facilitated by NATO member states, in addition to the peace facility that Amanda mentioned. So this is really, if not quite, a UN Security Council, but it is certainly well beyond, US-EU sanctions on Russia, and this will really matter. And then, generally speaking, though, economic sanctions have a pretty poor history of deterring a determined government from particular actions. We've seen it in Iran most recently. Obviously, even, far more comprehensive sanctions imposed on Iraq in 1990, obviously didn't convince Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. So we need to be a little bit realistic also in what we can actually hope to achieve by these economic sanctions. And frankly, in my opinion, unfortunately, this means that we shouldn't expect Vladimir Putin in the short run to change his war tactics or sort of sue for peace. This will entirely be determined by factors on the ground in Ukraine, which in the short run, economic sanctions have a relatively limited ability to affect. But I think if you look at what has been agreed, it is both quantitatively but also qualitatively unprecedented. Here, I would just really highlight the financial sanctions imposed on the Russian central bank that has basically blocked about $300 billion worth of Russian foreign exchange reserves. That has already had a very significant impact on the value of the ruble and other things. But perhaps going forward, it also means that we actually have a fair pot of money. I mean, Amanda mentioned we should forgive Ukraine's foreign debt. that may well be, but certainly we already have 300 billion or so of Russian money that, in my opinion, should be exclusively channeled towards rebuilding Ukraine after after the war, and obviously under the assumption that Russian forces, etc., are completely withdrawn. Then you've had the de-swifting, as it's called, or basically the exclusion of certain Russian banking institutions from the global SWIFT network. There was a lot of talk about that about 2 weeks ago, and this was sort of a game changer. I mean, the reality is that it's not. It's very harmful to the banks involved, but unfortunately, and this is one of the loopholes in these sanctions that Amanda talked about, the EU governments explicitly decided not to include the largest Russian banks, Sberbank and Gazprom Bank, in the de-swifting, obviously in order to be able to continue to facilitate energy trade with Russia. So we have sort of directly and implicitly sat on our hands there. Then we have a very large list and a growing list of technology sanctions. This will not only in the medium term hamper Russia's ability to fight the war in an optimal way. It will limit their ability to produce new guided ammunitions, cruise missiles, and all that type of stuff. But equally importantly, the ban on servicing airplanes will mean that the Russian domestic aviation industry will shut down in a matter of relatively few weeks. Which obviously is quite important for a country the size of Russia. We have seen all the major providers of oil maintenance services have withdrawn from Russia, partly voluntarily, but also as a result of sanctions. This will mean that Russia's oil production capacity will quite significantly decline quite rapidly. By rapidly, I mean probably over the course of the next couple of months. And we can talk about this later, but the way these sanctions have been imposed also actually means that it's quite difficult for, say, Chinese companies to come in and fill the gap after Western companies have withdrawn from Russia. And then finally, and this is also, I think, an important financial sanction, which is that so many companies have voluntarily left Russia. I mean, there really is a remarkable degree of brand consciousness here. When IKEA, McDonald's, etc., leave Russia, it's clearly a political statement, or you can sort of call it, weaponized ESG. But this matters. Arguably, this matters more, in my opinion, for the average urban Russian middle-class person, that the shops and products and services that he or she used to rely on are no longer there, even if they're not directly sanctioned. Simply withdrawn. Then let me just quickly also say, I mean, Amanda already mentioned, the refugee situation, which I certainly approve wholeheartedly of. I will, however, note that there doesn't yet seem to be a willingness of EU governments to really draw, in my opinion, the necessary fiscal implications of the decisions taken. We now have well over going quickly to 3 million refugees having entered the EU. The overwhelming majority in Poland, which is not, I should add, among the richest members of the Union. OECD estimates from back, 2014, during the most recent refugee inflow, suggested that the average cost of a refugee, clothing, schooling for children, etc., might be 10,000 euros per person per year. So you do the math, 3 million and rising. Well, that's already 30 billion euros. As a direct result of a common EU decision on common EU borders, my contention is that we will need common EU funding to address this issue. But obviously, certainly that seems to have been the case at the Versailles summit. There was no immediate willingness by some member states to do this. I think that's highly problematic also for one other reason, which is that when Poland doesn't get money for the new money, I think you're going to see increased pressure to provide Poland with the money that is already available from the Next Generation EU Fund, which is another way of saying that the rule of law will be waived, which I certainly would be strongly opposed to. And I quite frankly think that the governments, the member state governments in, say, Germany, Finland, and Sweden, that have come out, or at least, more or less came out against more common fund provision for refugees, for instance, are going to have to own up to the fact that they will be actively, in my opinion, potentially helping to undermine the rule of law provisions. Then finally, let me just say that there's one more thing that the EU has done, which I think will be hugely important, which is that even if all member states have not approved yet, the EU membership process for Ukraine has started. Everyone understands that this isn't going to happen next year or even 5 years from now, but who knows, 2030. It took Croatia 10 years after they started in 2003 till they became members. But the whole point here is that it's a process. It's a very long-term one, but it's an absolutely crucial one for Ukraine, especially also during the peace negotiations with Russia, because Russia wants a neutral Ukraine. That's why many people said, okay, we won't join NATO. But Russia probably does not want Ukraine in the EU either. And therefore, by actually starting officially this process, the EU has sent a very clear signal. Ultimately, it will be up to the Ukraine to decide with itself whether it can adhere to all the requirements over many years. But the decision taken by the EU Commission on this, blessed of course by member states, I think is hugely important, and arguably, in my opinion, as we move into the peace talks, is going to be one of the most important direct decisions that the EU has taken so far in this crisis. Well, let me finish there.
Thanks a lot, Jakob. I think you mentioned some really important points as well. We already have a few questions coming in, but before that, I'd like to ask you two questions. The first one is, I think Amanda mentioned it on enforcement and on the loopholes. Can you maybe explain where we stand, and are the sanctions, now the new packages there to kind of close the loopholes? Are they implemented? I read, for instance, that in the EU, it's national courts that are responsible for implementation. So how effective are we also at implementing these sanction mechanisms?
Well, I mean, if I can start, I think that a lot of the financial sanctions are, instantaneous. Banks are either on SWIFT or they're not, and companies have they're either in Russia or they're not. There is, of course, another set of issues related to, for instance, asset seizure by governments in the EU against individuals, sanctioned, the oligarch issue. That is taking, I think, longer than many would like, let me put it that way, but I think that this is happening. But at the same time, we should be clear. The biggest loophole in these sanctions by far, the gate, if you like, the city gate size hole in these sanctions, it relates to energy, which is something that we have done to ourselves. Because as the argument goes, not doing so would hurt ourselves more than Russia. I would personally be skeptical about that argument, but that's what has been decided. So the loopholes frankly are of our own making, so to speak, first and foremost.
I don't know if Amanda, you want to come in? No? In that case, I'd like to, actually, it's a question that was asked also on China's position. I think, Jakob, you mentioned also that Chinese companies might not come in Russia to fill the gaps. If you can elaborate on that, and also to Amanda, what kind of position is China taking? Because we were looking at it and it seemed to be siding with Russia and then not again. So where do we stand? So maybe we'll start with Amanda and then go back to Jakob.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I still think that China has some sort of ambiguous position. We're still waiting to see where China will actually fall. Although I have to say that following the conversation that the president of China had with President Biden a few days ago, I think again the Americans put across the very important message that if China, does get into bed fully with the Russians, supports Russia's position, sends arms and whatnot, that will further exaggerate, let's say, agitate this war. There's going to be serious consequences. Obviously, for China, this isn't the position that it wants to find itself in. I mean, China doesn't want to be, economically isolated or sanctioned or whatnot. But at the same time, I think there's still a sense in Beijing that they want to at least try and adhere to some degree to this new agreement that they signed with the Russians during the Winter Olympics, which significantly upgraded relations in many different areas. So I think we still have to wait a bit to see where China's going to fall. But I mean, surely if China wants to remain as a major, economic player with ties, international ties, been able to do international trade and whatnot, it really can't afford to, let's say, get into bed with Putin.
Yeah, maybe if I can just complement what Amanda just said. I mean, I think first of all we should be clear that China didn't know this was going to happen. There's a lot of sort of straight ideas, theories about the Chinese knew about it, etc. There was 6,000 Chinese in Ukraine when this war started. The Chinese government, the embassy in Kiev had not prepared any evacuations, which I think is a pretty strong signal that they didn't know. Maybe they should have known, but they didn't. Secondly, from the Chinese point of view, certainly Xi Jinping's point of view, China's strategic rival right now is the United States, which is why they are in bed, if you like, with Russia to begin with, to a large extent, and also why they probably will find it very difficult, politically at least, by Xi Jinping especially, because it was after all him who received Putin during the Olympics, etc., for him to change saddles, horses. That'll be very difficult for him. Then I think it's also very important to recognize that China at the moment is actually in the middle of a very deep, multi-layered, deep domestic economic crisis. The Chinese real estate market, housing market is very, very wobbly. That's very important for sustaining economic growth. And then, of course, Hong Kong right now has by far the worst, in fact, the deadliest COVID outbreak anywhere at any time since 2020. Worse than Bergamo in Italy in the beginning of the crisis, worse than anything any other European country saw during the pandemic. The risk, of course, is because of a combination of low vaccination rates among the elderly population and ineffective Chinese vaccines, that many Chinese big cities will be next with Omicron. Which is why you're seeing these lockdowns, etc., in China. So domestically, China is under a lot of pressure, which also makes it perhaps difficult to explicitly break ties with Russia. Having said all that, however, the logic of these economic sanctions on Chinese companies is essentially the same kind of logic that applies to European companies when they were facing American sanctions for doing business with Iran. Namely, that any Chinese business that has larger exposure to global markets, and by global markets, I mean certainly the US and European and developed Asian markets, will always choose these markets over Russia. So if it is up to the individual Chinese company, they're not going to break these sanctions. This is true for banks. This is true for, suppliers of airline services, airplane maintenance, high-tech companies, etc., because they will be sanctioned. And it will hurt them more than, for instance, the type of sanctions that the US government levied on Huawei a few years ago. So from that point of view, China, the willingness of Chinese companies, I think, to directly, quote unquote, come to the aid of Russia, I think will be very limited. Doesn't mean that some state-owned enterprises won't be ordered by the government to do so, but still, the idea, frankly, in my opinion, that China will overall be able to make up for the loss of Russian engagement with quote unquote the West or the rest of the world, I think is a fantasy. Russia can certainly buy lots of wheat, they can buy a lot of gas and a lot of oil, but let's be honest, the EU is doing the same thing. We're doing exactly the same thing ourselves. So we cannot point fingers at Russia, at China for buying cheap oil or cheap gas, because we're doing the same thing. But what China cannot do is to come in and replace the day-to-day life amenities and the standard of living that Western companies in Russia has provided. That's certainly not going to be an option. And also, they're not going to be able to single-handedly prop up the Russian war effort or the Russian economy, because if they try to do that, the Chinese political loss, I mean, imagine if it was true that the Chinese government were contemplating, or actually went ahead with supplying directly military-related items to Russia. I mean, this would be the end of any political influence that China might have in Europe, for instance, which at the end of the day, for China, because the strategic rivalry is the United States, Europe is an even more important player in this for China than Russia is. Well, let me finish there.
Thank you, Jakub. Before I go to the questions, I have one more point where, especially for Amanda in that case, we've talked a lot about having oil and gas imports banned. And obviously we know that we're quite dependent on Russian gas. I mean, it's the case especially for Hungary, but also for Germany. I think it's 55% of Russian gas that we use in the energy mix. My question would be, would that be seen as a provocation by Putin? Because I think that's always the question of like, how far can we go and what is going to be seen as a provocation for Putin and how is he going to react to that? So my question would be, do we know what we are able to do without having an escalation of the situation, or are we in the blind at the moment?
I mean, I don't think we should be taking our decisions based on whether it's going to upset, President Putin or not, because perhaps this has been too much the policy of the EU in the past, considering what Russia thinks about a certain thing, appeasing the Russians rather than just taking difficult decisions. I mean, obviously the Russians are going to be upset, if that's a funny word to use, upset about cutting off oil and gas. And I'm guessing that Putin and many other people sitting in the Kremlin don't really believe it's going to happen, because as we know, we're still far too dependent on Russia for oil and gas, but it's something that needs to be done. We shouldn't be, as Europeans, sitting here shaking in our shoes over fear about how Russia might react. And this is something that President Zelensky and others in Ukraine keep, repeating over and over again. We need to stop thinking or making our policies not in response to Russia, but calculating in to a certain degree the possible Russian blowback. At the end of the day, the European Union has got itself into a very difficult situation. It did that all by itself. It didn't need the Russians to help it get into this difficult situation in terms of its dependence on Russian oil and gas. We promised time and time again, or EU officials made the commitment to reduce it. They didn't. So now a major decision needs to be made. And this does need to be made, because if it's not made, this money that we're paying every day, millions of euros or dollars, will continue to go into Russia's coffers and be used to finance this war machine. We shouldn't be thinking about them. We need to think about European security.
I don't know if Jakub, you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, look, Russia has the GDP of Spain, roughly. I mean, should we worry about what he does in an economic sense? I mean, we should worry about his use of chemical and nuclear and that type of weapons. But, the idea that we're somehow, if you like, hiding behind our fear that, if we cut off Russian oil exports to the EU, he's going to cut off gas. Well, he might do that. But, I basically think that then we will have to live with that, frankly. We cannot let ourselves be dictated by this declining economic power. You know, just perhaps one thing. I mean, I think it's true what Amanda says, that our ongoing purchases of oil and gas greatly, you know, helps the Russian economy. But I think we need to be a little careful with saying that it directly finances the war machine, because the reality is that the wages of Russian soldiers are paid in rubles, and in the least, again, in the short run, Russia produces the vast majority, in fact, all of its weaponry itself, which is another ruble-based expense. So it doesn't necessarily finance it directly, but what it does do is it helps the ruble exchange rate. It props it up. I mean, the first day of the sanctions, the ruble, a couple of days later, it went to 135. It has now strengthened back to about 115 or so. Because clearly people are seeing, well, actually, by current energy prices, maybe Russia's current account surplus in 2022 alone will be $300 billion, which, by the way, is roughly the size of the amount of foreign exchange reserves that were frozen. So it is critically important, in my opinion, that energy sanctions are imposed as quickly as possible. But as I said, I think the channel is much more economic than immediately impacting the war effort.
Thanks, Jakob. I think that's absolutely, yeah, a fair response. I think the fear is always to have that nuclear option that Putin unfortunately has. Now it's time for questions, and I know we only have 20 minutes left, but I already have a few questions. And if David Froci is there, if you want to, unmute your mic and ask your question, that would be great.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. I want to thank EPC for organizing the event. I work for the Internet Society. The Internet Society is a global nonprofit that works to ensure that the Internet remains as a force for good, open, globally connected, trustworthy, and secure, right? So on this topic of sanctions, we are very worried that they might create some indirect consequences on the Internet infrastructure. We've seen a couple of global companies stopping servicing Internet companies in Russia. We're seeing an Internet exchange point in London disconnecting the peering with the Russian networks. And in these times where the Internet is so important to deliver the truth, to keep people informed about what is happening, especially in the case of Russian citizens, we think the infrastructure needs to be preserved. So this is why, yes, of course, there is a need to impose sanctions on the oil, on energy, on financial systems, even on individuals. But we believe that it has to be done in a way that it ensures that the Internet infrastructure will not be harmed, it will not be damaged. We cannot accept that the Internet infrastructure is weakened by international sanctions. So what do you think about this? Is there a way that the EU or the US can redefine at least, or make sure that this is more targeted to avoid a harm on the Internet infrastructure? I'm not talking about services, I'm not talking about social media, I'm talking about the infrastructure.
Thank you, David Froci. I have two more questions, and I don't know if the people are still in the call and want to ask their questions live. The first one would be Ignacio Perez. I don't know if he's there. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, yes. Hi, thank you for the interesting discussion. And I wanted to ask about the domestic political situation in Russia. Obviously, we've seen some protests. It's obviously very risky for citizens to protest in Russia because they get detained. And over the past few years, we've seen Putin silence its opposition. So I was just wondering, is there any sort of chance? Obviously, we've seen in the past revolutions in Russia happen from the inside, not from the outside. Is there a chance of maybe not from kind of a popular uprising, but kind of Putin's circle kind of trying to persuade him to change tact or something else? And is this ultimately what the West wants to achieve, a regime change in Russia, even though it might not be kind of the outright stated priority, by putting pressure on basically trying to isolate Russia's economy? Thank you.
Thank you so much. A very important question. And I'll take a third one and then go back to the panelists. And that would be from Andrei Bogdan Sterechu. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I don't know if he's there. Yes, he is. If you could present yourself quickly, that would be great. Can you hear us? Oh, I think the connection.
Hello? Yeah.
The connection is quite bad.
I think the connection.
Okay, I think I'll just read that question because the connection was not good enough, but he was asking about Russian finances. So I'm just going to read it. There was an amendment in the US sanctions regime on March 2nd that allows for interest payments from the Russian Ministry of Finance and private entities to Western creditors until May 15. This has, for example, allowed Russia to service its 117 million coupon last week using its frozen reserves, delaying a potential default. Does this water down the sanctions on its FX reserves? Would this offset the negative effects of sanctions to the point where this measure would not be as powerful as thought? So clearly a question on finances and Russia and how it's affected. So I'm going to start off maybe with Jakob and then go back to Amanda. So choose from whatever of the three questions you want to answer.
Okay, but I can start with the first one. Sorry, the last one is sort of the easiest one. Obviously, if you allow Russian foreign exchange to be used to pay off debt, you could argue that it is it reduces the effectiveness and the comprehensiveness of these sanctions because it enables Russia to actually use its foreign exchange reserves for something. But on the other hand, then we can begin to debate, do we necessarily want Russia to go into a sovereign default? Because if you do that, you end up with an awful lot of legal fights with creditors that are trying to seize Russian assets, et cetera, which becomes very interesting. For instance, if, let's say, Gazprom were to default, well, then do we go in and seize Gazprom? Private creditors go in and seize Gazprom assets in Europe. What does that do to that gas exports to Europe that at least politicians are so worried about? So, a sovereign default is a tricky question, but no doubt that it is conceptually, at least, a loophole. We can decide whether it's politically expeditious or not. I think that's a political decision. On the internet question, well, look, I think that's true, but I don't think as far as I'm aware, at least, the basic internet infrastructure in Russia is not being directly targeted by sanctions. The most obvious interference in the internet in Russia has to do with the blocks that the Russian government are putting on uses of it. Now, this is more in the services sector provision of it, but I mean, it's Russia that has demanded that servers, etc., be located to Russia because they basically want to do what the Chinese are doing. They want a Russian version of the Great Firewall. And then, of course, you have individual companies that have chosen to withdraw services from Russia. Again, I don't think there's much, frankly, we can do about that. We can sympathize with it or not, but it's certainly not the direct result of Western sanctions from governments. So I think there are risks, but I don't think they're that big, and they're driven predominantly by the actions of the Russian government and private companies. Quickly on the Russian domestic scene, I think we should be realistic. Russia doesn't have a long history of palace coups. This idea that it's like being back in the Saddam Hussein era. Everybody was hoping that there'd be some sort of general that shot him. I think we underestimate the resilience of Putin inside Russia. And the best we could probably hope for was maybe something like what happened to Khrushchev in the 60s, when Khrushchev was replaced by Brezhnev. We can debate, was Khrushchev better or worse than Brezhnev? It certainly wasn't a sea change. And I think any palace coup in Russia wouldn't lead to Russia becoming a liberal democracy overnight. I think, on the other hand, what you're seeing in Russia is a lot of people, especially young, educated people, are voting with their feet. Immigration out of Russia by young people is very, very large and almost certainly accelerating at the moment. And then I think there is an interesting question, which is that with so many of Russia's elite forces being killed in Ukraine, including paramilitary, police, OMON, etc., that probably limits Vladimir Putin's central ability to control many of the Russian governors, etc. So I think there is maybe not a palace coup, but I certainly think the risk in Russia of further fragmentation within Russia arguably goes up as long as this war continues. So let me finish there.
Amanda, if you want to come in, especially on the domestic outlook of Russia, I think you have a particular expertise there as well.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I'll just comment very briefly on this point as well, because I more or less agree with everything that Jakub just said. I think that Putin calculated disastrously vis-a-vis Ukraine, because he's basically thrown away everything that he built over the last 20 years. And he's going to be unable to, claw back any of this. I think that he's on a slope where he will eventually, one way or another, be leaving office, possibly, as was just mentioned, by some sort of internal change. So I think he's sort of he's dug his own hole, if I can put it that way. But I mean, again, I don't see any chance that, the opposition in Russia will be coming to power anytime soon. I mean, you've had draconian repressive measures carried out in this country for years which have only worsened over the last few months. But I do think we are coming to the end of President Putin's story. I mean, he's been there 20 years. That's more than long enough, isn't it? But how it's all going to end, or who's going to replace him, is certainly the big question. But surely I think everybody in the West sort of expects or is thinking that this is going to be the end of the Putin reign one way or another sometime soon, and is hoping for that. But pushing Ukraine into some sort of peace deal will not be the way to achieve that. In fact, that would be the opposite. This would probably keep Putin there even longer.
Thanks. I think we have still time for the 2 more questions that are in the chat. So I don't know if Anna Aslanidze wants to come in. We'll see if she's there. Yes.
Hello.
Hello, if you want to ask.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the interesting discussion. Actually, my question is more regarding the sanctions and the market. So as you mentioned yourself earlier, that there have been many individual initiatives by private companies who voluntarily decided to end their operations in Russia. So it's a bit of a difficult guess, I suppose, but if you had to estimate, what do you think will happen? Will they quickly return if there is any clear signal for negotiations, or this will have more of a long-lasting effect, actually, even if the negotiations are succeeded and they won't be rushing to return back on the Russian market?
Thanks, very important question. And we have another question from Joost van Iersel. So I don't know if he's there. Yes, if you want to present yourself also quickly.
Okay, do you understand me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I am from The Hague. I am impressed by your arguments. I was somewhat surprised about Amanda's qualification of saying that the EU is doing very well. Well, maybe the last 2 weeks indeed, but the last 20 years certainly not. And I feel that you will agree with that. we underestimated everything that has to do with power play and geopolitical thinking. Okay, notwithstanding the French or even the British, the Germans is a disaster as a whole. Now, my question is, systemic changes of regimes are always due to internal evolutions. And how do you feel that there is now maybe a rally around the flag feeling in Russia, but how long will this last? How severe the consequences have to be that there is a sort of resistance of saying, come on guys, this can no longer be there? Or is there nothing of the sort in play?
Thank you very much. Also a very important question. I'd like to come back to the two panelists, and maybe we'll start with Amanda first, if you want to go into the
yeah, well, maybe I was also talking about the last few weeks, because if I was going to talk about, the longer history, I would agree with you. I mean, I think the EU's had an atrocious track record in playing, power politics and geopolitics and dealing with Russia. I mean, I could spend, 5 hours complaining about the approach of the EU towards Russia in the region and whatnot. So I do agree with you. On the second point, I think it's very difficult to actually understand, rallying around the flag. To what degree is this actual just total disinformation? Because it's actually very difficult to get a clear picture of what's really going on in Russia. Because, I mean, it seems to me, 95% of the population has been, let's say, if the term is brainwashed or mind washed, because they have so few lack of independent information. I mean, I have, friends in Ukraine who have relatives in Russia, even, brothers, sisters, uncles, and they don't believe that there's a war going on in Ukraine that's being, driven by the Russians, because these people are so brainwashed by this propaganda. When it comes to the sustainability of the Putin regime, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people that would go down with Putin as well. I mean, it's not just about him. I mean, he has a circle of his close advisors, his friends, these people that he has known since his days in St. Petersburg and before that in the KGB. So there's a lot at stake for a lot of people. But I mean, I think at least from my perspective, if I can put it this way, just leaving power, this isn't enough. I mean, he may leave power, he may be brought down, and all his cronies. What's important here actually is that these people are brought to the Hague, and they're charged with the war crimes that are taking place in Ukraine. This should be, the key goal here, beyond him leaving government.
Thanks, Jakub. Maybe also on the question on what companies are doing and how long it will last.
Yeah. Now, quickly, I mean, on the company strategy, I mean, obviously, yes, it will probably vary from sector to sector, but overall, I would be very skeptical, because many of these companies have left voluntarily, and implicitly also due to the risk of being affected by many of the financial sanctions. Now, I don't think these sanctions will be lifted before all Russian troops have withdrawn from Ukraine. It is possible that as part of a broader peace deal, in the end, Russia gets to keep Crimea or something like that. I don't know. But the point is that companies will not return to Russia until there is a peace deal and withdrawal of Russian troops accordingly. This is not going to happen just because there is a ceasefire. Which is another way of saying that we can begin to debate whether or not the Putin regime can survive such a peace deal, given the maximalist war aims that he had. But the bottom line is these sanctions and Western companies' absence from Russia is going to be a lengthy one, in my opinion. On the issue of again, internal, I think if you look at what's going on in Russia right now, it's pure fascism, right? I mean, it's basically explicit support for an aggressive war, and it's sort of a mismatch of traditional Russian grievances, NATO expansion, anti-Western stuff, denazification, which is absurd, given that Ukraine is the only country in the world, apart from Israel, that has a Jewish prime minister and president, and then they talk about denazification. So it's sort of a crude attempt to buy into this myth from the Soviet Union, which in the end wasn't really about communism. It was about victory in World War II. But it doesn't really, there's no there. In my opinion, it's just a mixture of different bits and pieces, but ultimately it's obviously fascism. When you can be arrested in the middle of Russian cities for carrying a blank sheet of paper. There's only one word for that, and it's fascism. And then, to echo what Amanda said, we shouldn't underestimate the combination, I think, of the power of propaganda, but probably equally importantly, the willingness of people to, the desire of people to believe what is expedient and what they like to believe. And what I mean by that is that, you go to the United States, over half of Republicans believe that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president, that Donald Trump won the election. They have a free press in the United States, but these people want to believe it. And even if many Russians, unfortunately, are going to be exposed to the information that they're committing terrible atrocities in Ukraine, they're going to want to believe that that's a lie, because obviously you've got some really nasty questions you have to ask yourself as a Russian, this being done, quote unquote, in your name. It's much easier to just believe the lies of the Kremlin. So I'm unfortunately quite pessimistic about this sort of popular groundswell against the Putin regime. The people who get instigated are either going to be in jail or they're going to have left the country.
Thanks, Jakub. Before we stop, I have one last question to you, and I like to ask it because it's kind of a wishful thinking, but what is the EU measure you would like to see next taken in this situation? I know it's a difficult question, but Amanda, you had some recommendations at the beginning. So if in one sentence you can give us what you would wish to see in the coming weeks or months.
I mean, what I want to see is a quick response from the Commission, a quick avis on Ukraine's membership application. I think this would be really important and very symbolic. And we all need to remind ourselves as well that Ukraine isn't starting this process from scratch. It's been implementing an association agreement and deep and comprehensive free trade agreement for many years. And the reforms that Ukraine has been doing, in many cases, are almost identical to the Copenhagen criteria. Mm-hmm. So I think this would be a very strong message that the EU really does want Ukraine within it. We don't want to be waiting 4 or 5 years for this avis to come back.
Yeah. Thanks, Amanda. And in one sentence, Jakub, what do you want to see?
Yeah, I mean, I want the EU leaders to accept the fiscal responsibility of the common decisions they've taken that have real common implications on how we manage our common borders, refugees, clearly the need for the EU to become a full-fledged or more of a full-fledged geopolitical actor, because you know what? We were very lucky that Joe Biden was president when this happened. If this has happened 2 years ago and the president in the White House had been Donald Trump, things would have looked a lot differently. So, all these things cost money. And therefore, I think, and I know, it's well known, this was discussed at the Versailles summit. We have more common tasks to do together. We've taken common decisions and we need more common funding. So that's basically my next step.
Thanks for being so quick and so concrete in your actions. I hope that maybe some of the EU institutions are listening in. Thanks to you as speakers for taking time. Thanks to the participants. I know there were some more questions we couldn't answer, but thanks a lot for taking the time to listen to online events. I know they are quite exhausting after a while, so we try to keep it short. And also thanks for the team for putting this together, especially Nat and Philippe, who are behind that, for putting it together. I'm sure we'll continue this discussion about the EU's answer, because we're obviously in the middle of another package, and this war is going to continue making headlines, I'm quite sure, in the coming month. We'll see if there is some resolution in sight. I hope so. On that note, I wish you all a wonderful afternoon and a good week. And bye.